Good morning, America.
Hi, honey.
Hi.
Thanks for coming back.
My pleasure.
I just want to ask you a few questions
Yes.
about being a rabbi and a Jewish person. Not necessarily in that order, since that is the opposite order that they usually happen. Mm-hmm. For those who are listening who don't know, which is probably everyone, what kind of rabbi are you, denominationally speaking? Let me rephrase that. How are you ordained? In what movement or flavor of Judaism were you ordained, and what does it mean, and what is that about?
Great, because that's actually a different question.
Yes.
I was ordained in the conservative movement. There are currently 3 major denominations in American Judaism: Reform, Conservative, and Orthodoxy. And I was raised in the conservative movement. My grandfather, whose synagogue I grew up in, was a conservative rabbi, and 2 of my uncles became conservative rabbis. And when I was considering going to rabbinical school, I looked around at a few different denominations, and for a number of reasons chose the conservative rabbinical program in Los Angeles. So after 5 years, I was ordained a conservative rabbi.
Anyone who knows me, like the people listening to this, and anyone who has ever met you before, I think would be surprised to hear the word conservative associated with you.
It's little c conservative, we say.
Well, no, I think it's big C.
Oh, you're right. It's big C conservative. It's a proper noun.
What does it mean?
So, well, for that, we probably need a little history lesson.
That's fine.
Okay. The idea of there being Jewish denominations is, in terms of Jewish history, a pretty recent development. For the vast majority of Jewish history, there's only been one Judaism. You're either Jewish or you're not. Just Jewish, as we say today. And it was a post-Enlightenment development that there emerged multiple denominations. And that was because after the Enlightenment, Jews were allowed to become full citizens of countries. Before that, they were considered another nationality, even though they were living fully in the diaspora. And so they couldn't get full citizenship. But once they could, and they began having access to the kinds of careers and opportunities that citizens did, Jews started assimilating. So they weren't ghettoized anymore. They could live amongst people, amongst other citizens, and integrate into society. And that didn't really work with the way that Judaism was practiced. And so a new form of Judaism that was basically like, we're still Jewish, but we're culturally assimilating into the dominant culture of the country we live in, emerged in the 1800s, called Reform Judaism. And so Reform Judaism was really radical. It abandoned a lot of Jewish cultural elements. It was completely unhalachic, meaning it didn't, Reform Jews didn't obligate themselves to Jewish law at all. They were, now we have a secular legal system that we are bound by. And a lot of the dominant religious qualities were adopted, synagogues were designed to look like churches, and
liturgy was changed to German from Hebrew.
Right. Liturgy was in the spoken language of that region instead of in Hebrew. So there emerged these 2, dichotomies of ways of being Jewish, and Reform Judaism started soon after in America. But there were, as time went on, there were a group of Jews that wanted something in between. So wanted to be culturally rich in Judaism, to be practicing halacha in certain ways, still feeling obligated to keep kosher and keep Shabbat, and raise their kids a certain way and teach their kids certain things, as the tradition says. And so that is the conservative movement, and it's about conserving Jewish culture. Obviously, today it has a lot of different connotations, but that is where the name of the movement comes from. And there's been a lot of discussion about changing the name of the movement because it really doesn't resonate with the types of people that fit best into the movement today.
Does the movement itself, regardless of what it's called, fit your own practice as a Jewish person and rabbi very well? And if so, or if not, why or why not?
Well, I think the most important thing I learned about the denominations in my conservative rabbinical school training was that the most Jewish thing that you can do is conserve while you evolve.
Nice.
And I think that the conservative movement does that well. And I kind of feel like the conservative movement is the most continuous with the way that Judaism has been practiced since its conception. Even though a lot of people think, like, they look at Orthodox communities and they're like, oh, this is what Judaism looked like hundreds of years ago. Mm-hmm. Not actually, no. I would say the spread of the conservative movement is more realistic. And maybe like into modern Orthodox, like the ultra Orthodox practice is a very modern creation. The way they dress, the like extreme restrictions.
Very modern relative to ancient Israel.
Right. Yeah, like a few hundred years old.
Yeah.
The ways that like women are restricted, and so yeah.
The thing I want to hear more about is how you evolved as a rabbi after your training in this movement.
Right. So even though I just gave a big plug for conservative Judaism,
Yeah.
I don't identify really as a conservative rabbi.
Yeah.
I have this problem a lot when I'm filling out forms. I'm often asked to identify what movement I'm affiliated with. And I am affiliated with the conservative movement, but Ma'alot is not.
When you say filling out forms, you mean like you are interfacing with the institutional Jewish world in various ways.
And I'm always, and every single thing I sign up for, whether it's a retreat or it's a meeting or it's just signing up to go to a thing, mm-hmm. I'm asked what denomination I affiliate with, and I always have this moment of, well, kind of a few, kind of none, mm-hmm. but when in doubt, go conservative, because that's my training.
Do you ever have to give different answers in different contexts? Like specifically different answers?
Well, it also depends on what the question is, because mm-hmm. if it's about me specifically, I think the truest answer is conservative, because mm-hmm. that's my training. When it's about Ma'alot, I say it's non-denominational. Mm-hmm. But sometimes the wording is more vague than that, so I'm not really sure what it's asking. But obviously, I have a lot of influence from the conservative movement. I grew up conservative rabbinic line. I got trained in that movement. But on the surface, I look much closer to a renewal or a Reconstructionist rabbi. Mm. And some of that is in addition to growing up conservative, I also grew up Reconstructionist. Mm-hmm. My family, when my grandfather retired, switched to another synagogue that had a Reconstructionist minyan, and it was mostly run by students and faculty from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. So in my teen years, I got a pretty intensive Reconstructionist education, on the ground education.
This is like an unusual trajectory in Jewish life in America that you and I share coincidentally. Uh-huh. And it's something that I think is kind of strange about our path.
Yes, we have some weird some weird crossovers in our storylines.
Yeah. But just to sort of fast forward through what Reconstructionist is, the Reconstructionist movement split off from the conservative movement.
Yeah, so you may have noticed that I didn't mention Reconstructionist when I named the main three denominations, because Reconstructionist and Renewal are both fairly new. Reconstructionist, you could argue, started in the 20s or the 40s, and Renewals from the 80s. But yes, the Reconstructionist movement was founded by Mordecai Kaplan, who was a rabbi who taught at JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the conservative rabbinical school in New York. And so he was in the conservative movement, basically.
And didn't want to leave.
No, he didn't. He fit in well there.
Yeah.
There was no RRC when he was around.
Right. But his followers wanted him to, and he was like,
Yes.
no, this is how conservative Judaism evolves.
Exactly. Yeah. Evolution and Judaism as Civilization, which is the title of his sort of foundational book, is what drew people into that way of thinking, and makes a lot of sense. And I don't think that I philosophically subscribe completely to Judaism as civilization, the way that Kaplan wrote about it. And I have a different kind of spiritual relationship with God than what how he approaches it, which is more on the renewal side, more on the, which we can get to. But I do feel like the way that the movement has evolved and the way it navigates the world, and the centrality of justice work and supporting quieter, uplifting quieter voices in the community is something I feel very aligned with. And I just tend to like Reconstructionist rabbis. Like in Atlanta, I would say like my closest colleagues are Reconstructionists. So I have a Reconstructionist identity for sure. I also once won an award from the Reconstructionist movement.
Yes.
I got the Wizen Prize for an essay
like to
I wrote.
Tell everyone what that was about.
I think it was my 4th year of rabbinical school. I know, maybe it was my 5th year. I wrote a tshuva, which is a halachic argument, which is a argument or an essay about Jewish law, trying to clarify something about Jewish law that is not properly explored or decided upon by previous rabbis. So mine was on pornography, and there are previous conversations of pornography, but most of it is actually about masturbation for men specifically. And so this tshuva was a chance to kind of dive into like, what does pornography mean in society today, and how do people use it, and what are the implications of that in relation to both Jewish law and history and text, and modern day social dynamics, health, justice concerns of the industry, all of those type of things. And so I thought that the Reconstructionists would be into that.
It was the perfect place to go with that sort of sociological kind of Judaism.
Right.
I feel like. But you started to open up the spiritual differences, and that's the place where I want, because like I feel like a lot of people who aren't Jewish, especially if they're from Christian backgrounds, probably imagine that most of the differences between denominations, especially because that's like how denominations are in Christianity, are theologically distinguished from one another. And like Reconstructionist Judaism is theologically distinct from conservative Judaism, right? Wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Like I would say sort of the defining thing that makes it a split is that Reconstructionist Judaism is like way more like modernist about God and spirituality than conservative Judaism is. And I don't, and it doesn't seem like you fit in really either of those categories.
Yes. Well, I mean, the biggest distinction from the conservative point of view is that it's not a halachic movement. So you're not bound by the law.
Right.
Instead, it's a cultural thing. You're part of a civilization, and the civilization has norms. And so it's seen that way instead of like halachically, which in the conservative and Orthodox movement is God decrees that you behave a certain way. The rabbis interpret that, and you are bound by that because you are in a covenant with God. Mm-hmm. Your relationship, you've been automatically vowed into a certain set of behaviors by being born Jewish or becoming Jewish. So that's a big difference. But I also think that I think, and obviously I'm not a Reconstructionist rabbi, so my understanding of Mordechai Kaplan's philosophy is very basic. Mm-hmm. But I believe that there is a phrase that God is the will towards good, or, God, or like the will of goodness or something like mm-hmm. that. And which is a much more like amorphous kind of conception of God than what conservative movement would posit. Mm. And then renewal Judaism creates a lot more space, but leaning towards the mystical. Mm-hmm. And renewal never really, it's a movement, but it also kind of posited itself as like a movement that can be layered onto all the other denominations. So it's also the smallest movement. So like the renewal retreats and renewal membership has a lot of rabbis that are parts of other denominations and are just looking for more of that like permissive, mystical, spiritual, different ways of engaging with Judaism type of approach.
So I feel like what you've given us to think about is a bunch of different ways of seeing Judaism, the religion, the religious part. And I would love to hear you explain how you, as an individual Jewish person who is now a rabbi, navigate through these things to like your own way or toward your own way of seeing Judaism. How do all these different pieces play in, and where do you end up sort of between them?
Right. Well, there's another element that I draw from Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism's approach is that you're not halakhically bound, you're not legally bound to observe certain things, but you are required to learn and step into the process of learning and exploration so that you can figure out what is the best form of Judaism for you to learn yourself. And that's really what most of us do in the egalitarian movements and in Orthodox movements too, especially if moving towards the modern side. I was just talking to someone the other day that's like, most more modern Orthodox kids today use their cells on Shabbat.
Huh.
And I was like, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed.
But I'm also not surprised because there's, well, for a number of reasons. That's a little bit of a side conversation about cell phones on Shabbat.
Yeah.
But just, I think that part of how we're raised as Americans is that our choice is very centered. We're raised with like, you can be whatever you want to be. At least in previous generations, we were told that.
Yes.
And that, just that sort of sense of like, yes, you're part of a culture and you're part of a national culture, but you get to decide what career you want to pursue. You get to decide what person you want to be with. And so that really influences, that's also kind of a post-Enlightenment thing, but it influences the way that people relate to their Judaism. And there's all kinds of other sociological factors into why American Jews relate to their Judaism this or that way. But feeling like I want to make a choice for what's best for me, what's holistically the most supportive for me and my family and my system is a very common approach across egalitarian denominations. And when I say egalitarian denominations, I mean Jewish denominations that have said men and women are equal, and that women are able to engage in all of the forms and practices of Judaism. And I make that distinction because once you cross over that egalitarian line, there's a lot of more other things evolving along with that part of Judaism.
Mm-hmm. And so as a rabbi, how do you lead from the place that you have arrived here for yourself, especially with the kind of community that you have where like people don't like, if you ask most of them what denomination of Judaism are they would be like, I have no idea.
Right. Well, I think it's less and less meaningful as time goes on, and which is a very interesting thing. And I wonder if this will just be a blip in Jewish history, that for a few hundred years there was a bunch of different named denominations. I mean, there's always been lots of different ways to practice Judaism throughout history. Often it's been regional. There's, in addition to ethnic differences, it's Sephardic Judaism, Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, Ugandan, like there's all these different groups, and denominations are beyond those distinctions, but there's always been a lot of diversity in Judaism. And so I don't want to state the significance of the denominations. It's kind of normative, and it feels kind of transitional to me. And so my approach is I just kind of pull what I find useful from whatever denomination I want. And there's a lot to also learn from Orthodox Judaism, and the times that I have spent in Orthodox spaces of prayer and community have had a huge impact on me and the way that I understand Judaism and want Jewish community to look and feel. And I think that the best rabbis have that breadth of experience. It might be across different denominations. It might be across different communities within a denomination. It might be across different religions. It might be across history. You have to pull, part of what a rabbi's role is to pull across some cross section into Judaism to make Judaism come alive and feel relevant and really speak to people where they're at. So there's lots of different ways to do that. But there's no effective rabbi who's just like sitting inside of a denomination and like staying there. He or she or they are always looking around at what else can be in dialogue with this tradition. So I like to put the denominations in dialogue with each other a little bit in my head. And then I also just have my rabbis that I turn to. And the rabbis some of them are like Reb Zalman is one of them. He founded the Renewal Movement. Reb Zalman, Shachter Shlomi, some of them are associated with a movement, but some of them are just, maybe they were in a denomination, but they're not, they're more than that. They represent something beyond that, a certain way of seeing Judaism, a certain way of living their Judaism. And so I don't let myself get too boxed in by like what the conservative movement says or I should or shouldn't do now. During rabbinical school, I really tried to be conservative. I really was like, I'm going to fully dedicate myself to this and do this for these years. But now I see that that's not actually what's important.